Place. All right, that actually is helpful to me in terms of planning a tour.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, so we are live. I'm going to welcome everybody. Hello, welcome everybody, and welcome back if you've been watching the Sanibel Island Writers Conference all day today, as I've had the great privilege of doing. I am Jenna Blum. I am an author at the conference and also the CEO of A Mighty Blaze, which is producing the Sanibel Island Writers Conference online this year so that more and more people can see it and become acquainted with our fabulous writers. We are in the presence of greatness this evening. There is nobody more fabulous than these ladies, and I know this because I have the pleasure of being friends with them, but also just chilling in the green room with them. I am with Christina Baker Kline and Joyce Maynard, and I shortly am going to wink out and leave them to a conversation. We encourage you to ask questions in whatever medium you're in because the authors see them and answer your questions. We love that kind of interaction. And I am going to introduce Joyce and then Christina, and then ladies, you can take it away. So even though neither of you really needs introduction, Joyce Maynard is the author of 18 books. Suddenly I feel like a slacker. Thank you, Joyce. Including the New York Times bestselling novel Labor Day and To Die For, both adapted for film, one of them with Kate Winslet, which I really love. Under the Influence, among many other novels and memoirs, At Home in the World and The Best of Us, about her late husband, Jim. Her latest novel, Count the Ways, the story of a marriage, a divorce, and the children who survived it, will be published in, mark your calendars, June 2021. So everybody's very excited about that. Maynard's essays have been published in Vogue, Salon, and New York Times Modern Love and Lives columns, as well as dozens of other publications and anthologized in numerous collections. The newest novel will be published by Harper, which is great. I'm your Harper sister, and you're currently at work at...
So Christina.
Oh, yes. Oh, my God. Yeah. We're like Harper triplets. Hi, Harper. Hi. I hope my editor is watching because I love her, and also my publicist, Catherine Beitner, who I also love. And tell us if this is true. You're at work on a book about your return to Yale 2 years ago as an undergrad, 48 years after you dropped out at age 18.
And I am still an undergrad, slowly working it through. Yeah, that's true.
Honestly, I think that is super fantastic because when I was an undergrad at 18, I was too scared to ask any questions, and it was a totally wasted experience on me, really. I mean, I hope my parents in heaven aren't hearing that, but it's true. So I can't wait to read those. I can't wait for Count the Ways to come out. Christina Baker Kline, the notorious CBK, is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of 8 novels, including her latest, The Exiles. You ladies should be holding up your book covers, by the way. Thank you. Woo, thank you.
I can't hold mine up because it doesn't exist yet.
Exactly. You can hold it up in your head and sort of beam it out to us. Exiles just came out this summer, right, and marched onto the Times list instantly. I was happy to see. She's also the author of Orphan Train, which many of you know and love, and A Piece of the World with its gorgeous cover. Christina Baker Kline is published in 40 countries. Your novels have received the New England Prize for Fiction, the Maine Literary Award, Barnes & Noble Discover Award, among other prizes, and have been chosen by hundreds of communities, universities, and schools as one book, one read selections. Christina's essays, articles, and reviews have appeared in publications such as the New York Times, the New York Times Book Review, the Boston Globe, the San Francisco Chronicle, LitHub, Psychology Today, and Salon. So we are so happy to have you both here. Ladies, I am going to turn the floor over to you. Have a wonderful conversation. We will all be watching with great joy and avidity. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jenna. That was amazing. Thanks.
It's so good to see you, Christina.
Joyce, I love doing events with you. We have done events together before.
We have, and I hope there's more in our future, but it's a
there will be.
precious moment. I have to tell everybody that I got a copy of The Exiles just about 10 days ago, and I'm an extremely slow reader, and it is a weighty book. So I just finished it today and a couple of hours ago, and I'm really looking forward to asking you a lot of questions about that. And
that's great.
Whatever else pops into our heads. And I invited a bunch of my readers and Facebook followers, and I bet you did too, Christina. And so I hope people will weigh in with what's on their minds.
Yeah, that's great. I know both of us welcome questions from people, and I'm so looking forward to having a conversation with you about this and your own writing as well. I mean, I think part of the reason people go attend either in person or now, of course, virtually, these kinds of writing conferences is that they want to know about process and they want to know about methodology and all of those questions. So many writers who are tuning in, as I tune in often, to hear other people, I'm sure. So it'll be fun to talk about all of it.
I of course know what the book is about, but I wanted you to tell the people who haven't read it yet. Christina, tell us all a little bit about The Exiles.
Sure. So The Exiles is the story, the sort of macro picture in one sentence is The Exiles is the story of the convict women who transformed Australia in the 19th century and the Aboriginal people whose way of life was destroyed when British colonists landed on their shores. And
This was familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah. This was in the 1840s, and my novel takes place over 4 years pretty much, and then jumps ahead in time to sort of, and you learn what happened to a bunch of the characters. So yeah, it was a very long time ago. I've never written about a period so far from our own, and it was a huge challenge, but ultimately incredibly rewarding, and I loved it.
I want to tell everybody that in the acknowledgments at the end of the book, I think there are about 3 pages listing all the books, all the resources that you drew on for writing this book. It's a completely different kind of work than what I do, and I love that that's so. I've never written a historical novel, and my work is grounded very much in sort of now or recent years. I know a little bit of the answer to this question, but I think so many people would want to hear how you go about, not even just for this book, Christina, but how you know when you've landed on the subject that you're going to be spending the next, 3, 4, 5 years immersed in.
Yeah, that's a great question. Before I answer, which I want to do and will do, Joyce, I want to ask you though, when I write contemporary novels, which I did until Orphan Train, most of my novels took place entirely in the present. My first one had some stuff in the past, but even then I had to do research because you don't know everything about the world. Do you find that yourself, or do you just not have to at all?
I'm not a researcher. I'm not. Mm-hmm. I'm learning that as a Yale student too, actually. Yeah. And it doesn't mean that I just write from my life. But for me, I have to have inhabited a world sufficiently that I can write about it. So the majority of my novels, for instance, are set in New Hampshire or Vermont. I've lived on the East Coast most of my life. I eventually moved to California, and I think I had to live in California about 12 years before I dared set anything in California. A very valuable additional resource, I will say, for me that has expanded not just my writing life, but my life as a human being, comes from the fact that in addition to being a writer of fiction and memoir, I teach writing. I teach only memoir, and I only teach women. And I carry with me hundreds of women's stories that they share with me, and they're confidential. Whenever a woman comes to one of my gatherings, it's with the promise that her story stays in that circle, and it does. But it has informed my understanding of so many characters beyond me, and in small and large ways, the stories that I've heard find their ways into my novels, not in any way that I think violates confidences. But so no, I don't go to the library, but I've been, I'm sure this is true for you too. If you live your life as a writer, you're always on duty. You're always listening. You're always, to some degree, you're a little bit of an outsider as a result of that. I'm always looking for the stories that move me, and then I know those are the ones that are going to move readers.
Yeah. That's interesting that you say that, because it leads sort of straight into how I stumbled on this story.
Yes.
I find I used to have a different way of operating when I wrote novels that weren't. My last 3 novels have been set in the past in one way or another. In the mid-19th century, early to mid-19th century, my last 2, 20th. And then this one was mid-19th. And before that, I sort of felt that novels came to me in bits and pieces, that I was a magpie assembling sort of, there's this wonderful Virginia Woolf quote. She says, gather the pieces that come your way. And I would gather pieces and sort of layer them together and devise a story that was set in the present day and that had something to do with the world I knew, but wasn't necessarily my world. And what changed with Orphan Train is that I had this sort of thunderbolt experience when I heard this story about my husband's grandfather, who had been featured in a newspaper article that no one had ever read when he was alive in the family, about orphan train riders. And he had been orphaned with his siblings, 5 of them, sent on a train to North Dakota. And that I had this sort of tingle. I think of it as like a spidey sense. I had this full
I know that one.
That it was a huge story and that I didn't know if I could do it. And so I wrote another novel. I think I published 2 nonfiction books in that period. I waited a while until I had gathered material, until I felt, I don't know, more. It was a scary topic to take on because I am not descended from orphan train riders, and most of the people who've written about them are historians. I'm neither. So it was a complicated decision to do it, especially because I'd never written fiction set in the past. But that set me on this path then of discovering stories that kind of hit me with a boom. And the next one was about Christina Olsen. That's okay. So anyway, the third one was this. I read an article in the New York Times that was Lisa Belkin, this wonderful journalist, used to have a column called Mother Lode that was about parenting. I was raising children, and I read it. And this particular one happened to be about convict women, British women transported to Australia and living on these convict ships, often repurposed slaving ships, with their children, and what that was like, sort of comparing it to parenting today. And I was struck by the story, but I didn't know. This is the thing about having this sort of like struck by a story thing, is that it wasn't until I finished writing the book that I understood my motivations. Why did that story hit me and not hit the next person? What was it that made that jump for me? And I now realize that it was 3 different strands. One, I had been a Rotary Fellow to Australia in my 20s. And I loved it and was immersed in Australian culture. And I read Robert Hughes's The Fatal Shore, which is a history of Australia that is incredibly immersive, profound, large, 688 pages. And in that incredible book, only 1 chapter is devoted to convict women and Native and Aboriginal people, and together, 1 chapter together. And that was the chapter that interested me most. So there was that. Then I wrote a book on feminism with my mother, and we interviewed 60 women. Joyce, I'm thinking about your experience.
I actually wrote that down. Women telling the truth about their lives, which is kind of what.
Wow. And so I just heard all these stories. I think I was struck writing that nonfiction book, how important it is to hear stories that haven't been heard. And
story.
how much I wanted to be a part of telling those stories. So I did that book, and then I went to work in a women's prison in New Jersey. And that was the third thing. I, like you, have taught for many, many years. Now I teach workshops, but I used to teach full-time in colleges. And then I realized, I was still teaching, but I thought I'd like to teach a population that isn't used to writing about themselves, where it might actually be helpful. And so I applied. No one ever taught creative writing in this, only all-female women's prison in New Jersey, in Clinton, New Jersey, the Edna Mahan facility. And I taught a class of about 15 women, and it was profoundly affecting. I mean, I learned, first of all, it got me really interested in the criminal justice system, the foster care system, all the stuff that's happening now in terms of, prisoners' rights and everything else. It was profoundly interesting. But so you combine prisoners, convicts, with this book about writing about women, and then my interest in Australia, and now I see where all those bits and pieces came together.
I so connect with that, Christina. Very often, when I'm teaching, I often say to my students, write down your obsessions. And you might not think you have to write down your obsessions because they're your obsessions. They haunt you. But those are, for me, the engines that attach to my work or propel my work. And sometimes I don't know until, like you, for me, the novel that was most strikingly, seemingly away from my life was To Die For, the story of this sort of blonde bombshell young teacher who seduces her 15-year-old student and convinces him to murder her husband. Where am I in that story? And I did write that story very deliberately at a moment when I wanted to just leave my life and go somewhere else and immerse myself in something that had nothing to do with me. But after it was all over, bam, I saw my obsessions: television, fame, success.
Not to mention an inverse of your
young person. And I missed it completely until I read the book that I had written, and then I saw it, and I know now to use that in my work.
Isn't that incredible about writing, that there's this alchemy that happens, and that you don't? I mean, and in part, you have to allow that to happen and not delve too deeply into your motivations until you do it, because otherwise you can really screw things up for yourself.
Exactly.
You start prescribing. Yeah.
And moving the players on the chessboard as opposed to sort of letting them lead you and see where they take you. The story that I tell about this, one of the more dramatic moments of it for me was I had the real gift a number of years ago of a 2-month residency at the MacDowell Colony. And I didn't know, I went there at a kind of low time in my writing life and my personal life. I had written a memoir that had made me sort of persona non grata in many circles. And I didn't have an agent, I didn't have an editor, and I spent the first 6 weeks of my 8-week residency writing a memoir that was well written. I know it was about a period of my life that I had not really tackled before. And at the 6-week point, I'd written about 500 pages, and I suddenly knew that's not the book. And I had about 11 days left. And I put my head on the pillow that night. I wasn't going to squander those precious last days at MacDowell. And so I said a little prayer, which I do, my little sort of writing prayer, that a story would come to me. And I put some obsessions into my brain. And one of them was being a single parent of sons and remembering the loneliness of trying to have a life for myself and possibly a romantic life while watching teenage boys develop theirs. And one was bizarrely a correspondence that I had with a man in prison, not a good man, a man who turned out to be a very scary man. And then there were sort of weird things. It was Labor Day weekend coming up, and I was thinking about back to school. And the next morning I woke up, and like a gift, I heard the voice of a 13-year-old boy in my head, coming from seemingly nowhere, but from the deepest part of me, telling me the story of a Labor Day weekend in which he and his very troubled single mother went off back to school shopping, and an escaped convict came up to them in the Walmart and said, with blood dripping down his head, "Would you take me home?" And she did. And the two of them fell in love. And the boy is watching his mother's love affair play out over the course of a 6-day Labor Day weekend. It's that wonderful combination of my life and exactly what my life was not, which is the exciting thing to do as a fiction writer, to go where we haven't gone in life.
Yeah, that's really true. It's a beautiful story. I love that.
And you did it so beautifully in this book. I would myself be very daunted to set a work of fiction in a place that was foreign to me. And clearly, you went there, you did your research there, but you were not of that place, and yet you got those people's voices.
I was daunted before I started doing this. In fact, I remember when Katherine Harrison, who wrote contemporary books, including memoirs, did not. I remember when she wrote a historical book, and I thought, I will never do that. I don't even understand the impulse. It seems entirely foreign to me, and it feels fake. Like I didn't live it. I'm not alive for that. Why would anyone do that? I really did feel that way. It's strange in a way that I've gone on to write fiction set in the past. The only thing I can tell you that is true about writing fiction set in the past, for me, the key to it is writing a contemporary novel that's set in the past. In other words, I'm not trying to recreate a novel written in 1840.
Which is Charles Dickens.
Yeah, I want to transport my readers there. And I read this great interview with Hilary Mantel in the New York Review of Books, I think, where she was talking about how her dialogue, her characterization, she said, of course, I strive to be accurate, as do I. I don't want to be anachronistic about anything, but she said, but I'm really writing as if these characters exist in the world today, or are on your favorite television show or something.
Well, it's a great combination. I somewhere near the end, the word hence came up in your book. And I thought, I'm sure Christina doesn't use that word in conversation, but you had probably lived with these characters so long. There are 4 women that we come to know very well. And they sort of, each one kind of passes the story on to the next, like a series of relay runners. And one does the first lap, and then she passes on the story and the baby that she has onto another character. And what I took away was that how universal so much of their stories is. Women are not transported on, virtual slave ships anymore, but the marginalization of women's stories and women having to undergo kinds of hardships, often at the hands of men and male-dominated society, is one we can all relate to.
Well, there are still many aspects of our society that want women to have fewer rights and that are trying to push things back for women. So at this point in our American presidential process, I have a lot of fear that I didn't have 5 years ago about what could be rolled back in this country. So yeah, I find that pretty current. And I wrote this book in a time of political turmoil in America. And I think, there's no question to me that many of the things that came up for me as I was writing the book that took place in the past resonated very strongly with things that are happening today. As you said, in most parts of the world, women are not stuck on convict ships and sent to prison in that way. But boy, women's rights are a constant battle, and the right to be heard, the right to be respected, the right to be believed, all of those things are part of my story, and they're part of our story today. So I loved that in the book, that I was able to sort of work with three different, very different characters who approach their own subjugation in different ways, and kind of give the reader this broad sense of how people respond to trauma and tragedy. Even before I wrote books set in the past, I came to realize, I think how reviewers sort of tell you what your themes are, and you're like, oh, that's true. Those are my themes, sort of. I've always been interested in exploring the legacy of trauma, and how it's passed from one generation to the next, and how it plays out. The legacy is in particular of like an event that has reverberations over time. And it's true in my historical fiction, but as I say, it was also true in my contemporary work. So in a way, you were talking about your obsessions, Joyce. My own obsessions are the same in some ways, but it's just that the canvas has changed a bit.
I read I'm not going to give away anything about this novel, of course, but the book ends with the daughter of the first woman having the opportunity to confront the violator of somebody from decades earlier. And I thought about my memoir, At Home in the World, which is a nonfiction book, but which ends with a not fictional account of my going back to the door of a man who had violated me in some profound ways when I was very young. And it's a kind of triumphant moment. It was for me personally, and I think it is for readers. And I felt a similar sense reading your book. I wanted to ask you about, this is a question I grapple with a lot. Happy endings, either providing them or not. I have been, a couple of times readers have written to me when they were in the middle of a book and saying, "Oh, I hope that these characters are going to come out okay. I hope they'll have a happy ending." And and my editor once said, "Oh, can we have a happy ending?" And I cannot manufacture happiness out of cloth where the threads are not going to take me there. And happy takes many forms. But a redemptive ending is probably more what I feel I want as a reader. And I want to ask you what you feel, what you want, where you want to leave a reader.
This book has a real ending, as you saw, when you skip ahead 20-something years and find out what happened to a bunch of the characters. I've never done that before. It was really satisfying to do. I get it well. Yeah. I actually could have just ended it where the story ends, but I've sort of gotten this clamoring, like, I want to know what happens. So I thought, let me take that on. The book is intense. My novel is intense. A lot of things happen to these people, and it's not all good. A lot of it is hard. And so I wanted to end on sort of a moment of grace. I mean, it was hard, in particular. The story of the Aboriginal girl, Mathina, she was a real person, and her life ended tragically. I don't think it's giving anything away to say that, because you can Google her and find out very easily. She was famous and is famous in Australia. But I was drawn, as I told you, to the story of the convict women. And then I went to Australia twice to do research. And when I was there in Tasmania, I realized that it would be irresponsible not to address what happened to the Indigenous people at the very same time that I'm telling that my convict story takes place. And I wrestled with it because it's a really hard question. Does a writer, a writer who is English, Scottish, and Irish have the right to address a story of someone who's from a different culture? And that was really hard to figure out what I should do. All I can say is that ultimately Mathina is one of the threads of the story, because, as I say, I couldn't not tell part of that story, because as difficult as it was for the convict women to come through and survive, it was much harder and still is, frankly, for the Aboriginal people there. And there were a lot of parallels with our own story and the Native Americans here. So, I had expert help, a professor of Aboriginal studies who himself is descended from a Tasmanian tribe. And I had a sensitivity reader as well, that HarperCollins, that there's a lot of that stuff.
I have one of those for my new book too. It's a new world.
I mean, and I get it and I embrace it. I don't want to tell anyone else's story. I want to try to tell a complete story, I guess, in this novel, to give a sense of a bigger world. And so, that when you talk about happy endings, in real life, as I said, Mathina's story didn't have a happy ending. So I ended on a moment of connection. I did the same thing in my last novel, A Piece of the World. Christina Olsen, who was Andrew Wyeth's muse and the subject of his painting, Christina's World, the last 20 years of her life were very difficult. I ended when she sees the painting. There's this moment where she feels seen and understood. And that was sort of where I left it. So these are difficult choices, Joyce, aren't they? They
really are. And I have
more because
I have very strong feelings on this whole appropriation issue. I appreciate, first of all, I've been a student I've been an undergraduate at a university for the last 2.5 years. I am surrounded by young people who are hypersensitized to this idea of appropriation. And I've had a conversation with a young violinist in the symphony at Yale that won't play certain music because the composer's politics were no longer regarded as okay. And I've seen great books banned, people talking about Flannery O'Connor as maybe somebody we don't read anymore. I think that's death to not just literature, but to art, to all the arts, to limit us to the stories that we have lived and the cultures that we come from. And I think it's the nature of art to go beyond where we are and to imagine and create, and at the same time, to do it responsibly as you have. It's
a really hard question, and I honestly would not have written about her if it didn't just feel wrong not to do it. And
also, you didn't. She's in a world of other characters.
Yeah, she's not my central character.
Yeah. I think that's an important distinction.
I think it's good that we're all thinking and
I do too,
talking and understanding this. And my kid graduated from Yale recently, so I know what you're talking about. But that kind of sensitivity when I went to college in the late 80s actually did exist. It was just slightly different, but it was there. That's part of. I feel that young people are pushing, and they're radical. They're at the radical fringe, and they're pushing the country forward. And of course, right now we're experiencing a whole part of the country that's pushing back in this profound way. But I believe actually that radical impulse is ultimately great, and that it's going to change the country, and that young people, there's an army of them. And like looking at Flannery O'Connor. Yeah, let's look at Flannery O'Connor. I love Flannery O'Connor. I wrote part of my master's thesis on Flannery O'Connor, but I totally understand that there are questions. And that, we also know people lived in a different time and all of that, but still, all of it matters. My favorite, so when this spring, Lin-Manuel
Miranda
was on Twitter all the time because Hamilton was coming out as a film, right? And he got a lot of pushback and criticism because even though he had, there were all of his characters, most of them, I think, yeah, except for Jonathan Groff, were people of color. He didn't directly address slavery to the extent that his critics felt he should have. And his response was, you're right. You're right. I did what I could do. I did the best I could do. It's not good enough. Other people will, you mentioned earlier, taking the baton. Other people will take the baton and do more. And all I can do is my small part in this. And yeah, it's not perfect, but all I can do is try.
And part of what we need to portray is the not perfect world. My new novel that, as you know, isn't out yet, spans also 40 years in the life and marriage and after marriage of a woman from roughly sort of my era, falling in love and marrying in the late 70s, having children, a dream of a kind of a life and a family that ultimately breaks down in divorce, and then the aftermath of that divorce. And I wanted both to explore themes that I knew very well, because that has been my life, and that is one of the themes and obsessions in my life: family and the fracturing of a family and the children who come from that, and the woman who has experienced that. But I also wanted to transform it. Otherwise, why am I writing fiction? So I gave her, very deliberately, I gave this woman children completely unlike my children, or in there somewhere are embedded aspects of my children, but I shuffled the deck completely. And I gave her a child who's transgender, who always sort of feels out of sorts, and ultimately recognizes that the body that she was born in is not the body that she was meant to have, that they were meant to have. There's a thing that has changed for me. I used to not be able to do that pronoun thing, and now I get it. I embrace it. But because of that character, who's not a central character in the book, my book was also given to a sensitivity reader, and the sensitivity, they came back with very disturbed about the response of the mother in the book, the sort of me type character, to the child's statement to their mother that they were going to transition. And the mother is initially very upset, and this was viewed as transphobic. Well, the year was 1996 that this happened in the book. A real mother during those years, hearing that news. It's very different now. And I've worked with probably 20 women in my memoir workshop who are parents of a trans child, who embrace that and celebrate their child having found out who they really were all the time. But this mother's grief is also real. And I believe that as writers, we don't just report the way life is supposed to be. We report how life was and was.
Did you change things?
There were some things that I changed because of the sensitivity reader, but not that. The reader viewed that as a transphobic response, but that was a human response. And the woman changes over time and learns that this was actually a good thing that happened in her son's life. But did she do it without struggle? Of course not. Of course not. Few of us would have in 1996. Yeah. I'm going to be walking as I'm talking because I just saw that my battery is low. So I'm walking into my very messy kitchen now.
And I wonder if we should take some questions.
Actually. Yes, I'd love to have questions.
Okay. Do you know how to do that?
I'm hoping people can just chat. Just let us know that they're there. Where is my plug? Yikes. I know I have a plug here somewhere.
Well, does anyone have questions? Maybe in the comments. We would love to hear them.
I have a really bad problem now. What did I do with my charger? Oh, here it is.
Okay, well, so Rachel says the trouble is, how do you, as an outsider, know you're doing it responsibly? I think this is huge. I think the only way to know it is to have to do a ton of research, but also to have people read it who are from the community that you're writing about.
That is exactly what I did as well. And the
only way to do it, because you can't presume to know. And I think it is worth thinking about all of this stuff. I embrace and welcome conversation about it. I want to know what people think about it. I think it's really hard. And I also agree that I certainly don't want to be trying to appropriate anyone else's story. So yeah, I have
we can be storytellers whose scope extends beyond our own. I mean, otherwise, who am I? A sort of an irrelevant white woman, older white woman writer writing about my same experience. I want to stretch. Alejandro was here and then left. Alejandro said, good. Hi, Alejandro. Said, how has academic literary opinion and reviews changed on published female memoirs since the 90s? Whoa. Can I talk to that one? Have things gotten better or stayed the same? I'll maybe take this one, Christina, although I have things to say too. But as some of you may know, I published a memoir called At Home in the World in 1998 that told a story that I had kept secret for 25 years, that when I was 18 years old and a student at Yale, it's actually the reason why I left Yale, I published a magazine article that got a lot of attention, and among the 1,000 letters that I received was one from J.D. Salinger. I embarked on a correspondence with him. He was then in his 50s, I was 18. He ultimately invited me to come see him. I went thinking he was sort of my mentor and teacher, but ultimately moved in with him, dropped out of Yale, had what was an extraordinarily painful and difficult relationship and parting from him a year later, and then did not speak of it for 25 years. And when I did, an event that was really precipitated by my daughter turning the age that I was, when everything changed in my life, I was met with a tsunami of, I won't even say criticism, I'll say condemnation and very personal attack. I alluded to where I was when I went to MacDowell and wrote Labor Day. For years afterwards, I was kind of unpublishable. And Maureen Dowd in the New York Times called me a predator for presuming to tell this story. Would that happen now? Absolutely not. That was an early Me Too memoir, and it speaks very well of what's changed in our society, that nobody would anymore think that the 18-year-old girl who told the story of what the 53-year-old man did was the predator.
That's huge. That's actually huge. I mean, you're right. That is a concrete change, and it's that world now is very different. Yeah.
And it's so important, as a message to, I still at Yale, not a week goes by that I don't hear from, literally not a week goes by that I don't hear from some young woman telling me some version of the story that I lived. It still happens, but at least now I won't say that the problem doesn't happen anymore, or that the women to whom it happens, or the girls, or the young boys, it could happen to boys, are completely free of fear, because we all know examples of times that truth tellers have been set upon and condemned for doing that. But it's we've come a long way.
Yeah. So a number of people are asking about, we have a question here, but let me just answer this one first. A number of people are asking about sensitivity readers, and I just want to explain. I worked with people before my book was published who had nothing to do with my publisher. But then when I submitted the final manuscript, they found someone from the community to read the book also, even though I had already, as I said, worked with a number of people, done all this research, et cetera. Publishers are very aware of and sensitive to these questions that we've been, Joyce and I have both been discussing. And I welcomed it. I mean, I would like.
Oh, me too. I felt grateful for it. And I was caught in a couple of places where I didn't get it right. And no, in answer to somebody else's question, it's not a person from within the publishing house.
Right. It's some world who they go out and find.
Yeah. And I like you, Christina, I first found my own readers. I had a good trans friend of that generation, a young man who, and his mother was also important. But no, I respect that process, and I'm grateful for it.
I do want to say one thing that came up with my sensitivity reader, who felt, even after I had done all this stuff, as I said, and the the professor who had read it all and whatever many times, we'd all read it many times, but this person said that not knowing that Mathina's story is true, that she felt it ended sadly in a way that the other stories, well, some did too, but that she didn't want it to end sadly. And I
we want those sad stories to have happened, but they do.
Yeah. And I actually do sometimes, I've really wrestled with this. Should I have deviated from the historical record in telling her story? I don't know. I do think there's more I could have done, actually. I mean, look, who was I with the other night? I did an event the other night with someone who said they never reread and have never regretted anything in a book that they've published, that they've always been happy. I actually could edit my books till the cows come home.
I could too.
I like go back to a book and want to re-edit it. So I wrestle with this stuff. I think the decisions are tough. And, when you finish a book and you've got a book and there's your book, it feels like it's a done deal, but every single page you had to make a decision on, and every single page is hard won. And, you could have turned left when you turned right. So to say that I don't have any questions about what this final book is, I do. Of course, I have millions, but so I don't know. There's a lot of room for error, I guess is what I'm saying.
It hadn't occurred to me until you said that, but I suddenly realized that I actually kind of did revise a novel.
I did too.
My new novel. The new novel, Count the Ways, is the story of a marriage and a divorce and the aftermath. Back in the early 90s, I published a novel called Where Love Goes that was also had a divorced, much younger character, because I was younger when I wrote it. Who goes through a divorce, and it's a very bitter divorce and a very angry divorce, and the character is in an angry place. The new novel actually I didn't even know it until, because I don't reread my novels. So a friend of mine who had read the new novel said to me, there are a couple of scenes in the new novel that were in another form in Where Love Goes. And it doesn't bother me that this was so, because it was transformed. It was seen through a new lens. Mm-hmm. It was the death of a marriage seen through the lens of somebody 20 years, 25 years further down the line. And the book that I wrote now explores something that I didn't know how to go to in 1993, which is forgiveness.
I think that point is interesting. I mean, to me, it's interesting to me as a writer. I'm sure it's interesting to people out there as writers as well, because you write different books at different times. Yeah. And I find that often, if I take too long writing a book, I've almost become a different, sort of my experience has led me elsewhere, and I'm suddenly not even, I've got to finish the book so that I'm still in the same sort of, time warp. It's interesting that way. And I feel that way when I look back at my past books, that they're each of a time and place. And I actually tell my students, and Joyce, if anyone lives this, it's you. I mean, I take 3 years, sometimes 4, to publish a book. I mean, from start to end, I'm 3 or 4 years. You are so prolific and write so quickly. I mean, I know that about you. And I have to say, I'm always telling my students, finish the book before your life changes, before you are in a different place, because there really is something to that.
I'm not as extreme as I used to be when I was young, but my first novel, Baby Love, that I wrote when I was 26, I was supporting my little family I had one child then, by my writing. I could only afford to be working on something that I hadn't been paid for already for 10 days. I gave myself 10 days, and I put my daughter in crazy amounts of daycare for those 10 days because I thought she could survive that, and she did just fine, I think. And I wrote Baby Love. And at that point, I couldn't even go back to it. I was in a white heat. I I didn't cook dinner. I didn't clean the house. I did nothing but be in that world. And
wait, that's how you do it. You do
not always, and not this one.
You did it this spring.
I did do it this spring, but I will go back, and I can now re-enter the world of the novel. That one, it was as if I had, I'd been in Lost Horizon, that magical kingdom, and I couldn't find the way to get back to it anymore. And, I had a wonderful editor, Bob Gottlieb, who said, well, we love this book, but we'd like you to do some more work on it. I never could. I just couldn't find it again.
Yeah. Joyce, we are at the end.
Oh, no.
I know it's after 8. So
we're going to have to make them bring us back to Sanibel next year, or maybe sooner than next year.
Oh, that would be fun. Let's be there.
Can I just reserve you right now, Christina, to have a conversation when my book comes out? And I just want to keep talking. So, but we have time for one more question.
We'll do one more question. There are a million.
Why do you see them? I don't. But
I have up the comments on the right. Let's see here. I'm going back to see. Does anyone want to put a big question up? Because there were a bunch that we missed earlier, but I don't know. They're way back here. Okay, here's one. What do you think about the division between literary and genre fiction?
I'm not sure that I believe that there is such a division. I just believe there's good fiction and less good fiction. And that everything should be literary and everything should be enormously readable. And if a book is simply literary but doesn't have a good story, I probably am not going to be reading it. I don't know. How do you feel, Christina?
I think there is a distinction. I mean, a lot of books straddle literary and commercial fiction, but there are, as a reader, I'm really drawn to language and character.
Oh, no question. I didn't mean to suggest that.
I just mean more than plot. So I guess what I'm saying is, like, I don't tend to read mysteries or horror or I just don't really.
And I guess what I mean is that
I also think
genre, I need it to be written well. If it's not,
no, but I mean, but there are great writers. Like Agatha Christie is great. I just can't. What I can't wrap my head around as a reader is withholding certain information in a cat and mouse kind of way that then has a big reveal at the end. I mean, I get it, and I sometimes enjoy reading thrillers, but some people love mysteries and devour them like crazy.
Well, I'll give an example of, Stephen King would fall in the category, I suppose, of a genre writer in some ways, but to me, he's just a great writer. He's some books more than others, but he's and I think there's a concern that literary almost means it won't sell well. I don't assume that at all. I think when you tell a great story that is commercially a success and it's told wonderfully, that's what I mean.
But there are also great books that sell 25 copies. Like there are like Paul Harding's book Tinkers, before it was nominated for the National Book Award, I believe it was just, I think, a small press, as I remember, and exquisitely written. Not very many people had ever read it or heard about it. And there are a lot of really brilliant writers out there who don't sell tons of copies. And thank God that we live in a world where, where ultimately people can find a way to get published, I think, if they want to, in one way or another, independently.
I know they're going to pull the plug on us any second. And I was hoping that you'd leave us with a very short passage from The Exiles. Do you have such a thing handy?
Okay, I'm going to read for 1 minute. Okay. I'm going to read. I wasn't prepared, but I have a 1 minute reading. Okay. Just to give you a taste of this book. So my central character, Evangeline, is a governess, and she's falsely accused of a crime. She also is partly complicit. So here she is on her way to Newgate Prison. She's wrested out of her home and has never had anything like this happen to her. Okay, so now sitting in the drafty carriage, Evangeline moved her shackled wrists to the left side of her body and rubbed the place beneath her petticoat where she'd tucked the monogrammed handkerchief. With the fingers of one hand, she traced its faint outline, imagining she could feel the thread of Cecil's initials intertwined with the family crest, a lion, serpent, and crown. It was all she would ever have of him, except apparently for the child growing inside her. The carriage made its way west toward the river. No one spoke in the chilly compartment. Without realizing what she was doing, Evangeline inched closer to the solid warmth of the constable next to her. Glancing down, he curled his lip and shifted toward the window, widening the space between them. She felt a prickle of shock. She'd never in her life experienced a man's revulsion. She'd taken for granted the small gifts of kindness and solicitude that came her way, the butcher who gave her choice cuts of meat, the baker who saved her the last loaf. Slowly it dawned on her. She was about to learn what it was like to be contemptible. The end. Done.
I'm so glad you chose that passage. I put a star next to it.
That feeling, she was about to learn what it was like to be contemptible. I just thought, man, she's in for it. It's interesting. Yeah. Anyway, thank you so much.
You. Thank Sanibel, thank Tom, thank Jason. Wonderful to get to be together.
That was terrific.
Thank you all.
And happy birthday early, Joyce.
Yeah, happy birthday.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you guys.
We hope to be there in person next year.
I hope so too. That's the plan.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you.
Bye guys.
Bye-bye.